What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to the channel. I'm Jordan Wheeler with RTR Vehicles. In today's episode, we're going to be installing the 1.3-inch spacer lift for your Ford Bronco Sport. Inside your box, you'll find your 2 front strut spacers, 2 rear spring spacers, 2 rear spring spacer inserts, installation instructions, and your hardware kit, which includes 4 trailing arm spacers, 4 new trailing arm bolts, 2 socket head cap screws, 6 front strut studs and nuts, 2 roll pins, and thread locker. For this installation, we use the following tools for the front installation: an 18mm wrench, 3/8 socket wrench, 1/2-inch socket wrench, 1/4-inch socket wrench, a pry bar, torque wrenches, and a mallet. We also use an 8mm socket, 10mm socket, 13mm sockets, 18mm sockets, 21mm socket, T40 Torx bit, impact driver, and a body clip removal tool. For the rear spacer installation, we use 15mm socket, an 18mm socket, extension, 1/4-inch socket wrench, 3/8 socket wrench, impact driver, torque wrench, pry bar, drill, 1/8-inch drill bit, flathead screwdriver, center punch, drift punch, slip joint pliers, marker, mallet, 5mm Allen, and I will be using this trans jack, but if you're doing this in the driveway, you'll need 2 hydraulic jacks. Since I'm back at the RTR lab for this week's install, I had full access to our lineup of gear wrench tools, as well as these 2 post coats lifts. Now, you can handle this install yourself in your garage or driveway as long as you have 2 hydraulic jacks and a little bit of skill in handling a suspension install, or at least the guidance of a professional. And since we will be working with the suspension, please make sure to get your vehicle properly aligned after the install is complete. Let's start off by removing our wheels. Next, you'll remove the upper nut on the sway bar end link with either your 18mm wrench and T40 Torx bit, or your 18mm socket and impact driver. Disconnect the wheel speed sensor by releasing the bushing and then using your body clip remover to release the tree fur anchor. And using your 8mm socket, remove the bolt securing the brake hose to the strut. Turn your corner assembly and use your 21mm socket to remove the 2 knuckle nuts. Since these are spline bolts, reinstall the nuts backwards partially to create a striking surface for your mallet. This will drive the bolts out of the knuckle. If need be, lift up on the knuckle or use a wrench to turn out the rest of the bolt. Once removed, separate the strut from the knuckle. In the engine bay, pry the 6 clips off the cowl cover and set them aside. Next, remove the 2 10mm screws on the strut tower cover on each side. You'll need to lift the cowl to reach the second screw. Once removed, pull out the covers. Now you need to use your 13mm socket to remove the 3 strut bolts on the tower. With these removed, remove the strut from the vehicle. Next, take 3 of the supplied strut studs and apply thread locker to the short end of the stud. Then screw these into the upper mount where the factory bolts were removed. If needed, use the supplied nuts to help screw these in. You'll now set the RTR spacer over the studs on top of the strut mount, making sure the hole in the spacer lines up with the hole on the OEM mount. Carefully lift the strut up into the strut tower. Loosely installing the supplied lock nuts by hand. Reinstall the knuckle and insert the OEM spline bolts. Give them a tap with the mallet to set the bolt. Then install the OEM 21mm nuts and torque to 103 pound-feet. Resecure the wheel speed sensor cable, as well as the brake hose with its 8mm bolt. Tighten the strut bolts and torque to 28 pound-feet. Once this is completed, reinstall the strut cover and secure the cowl with the 6 retention clips. With the assistance of a pry bar, push the sway bar down to insert the end link stud. Tighten the nut and torque to 81 pound-feet. Using a jack, slowly lift the control arm until the trailing arm is parallel to the ground. If on the ground, use a second jack to support the trailing arm at the lower arm to frame joint. Next, separate the brake hose from the vehicle. If you're having difficulty, use a flathead screwdriver in the arch of the clip to pry free. Now, using your 18mm socket, remove the upper shock bolts. Then remove the lower shock bolt and control arm bolt with your 15mm socket. If using two jacks, slowly lower the first jack to unload the suspension and remove the shock from the vehicle. You can then press down on the control arm and remove the coil spring. Once out of the way, remove the spring isolator from the lower control arm. You may need to pry this off with a flathead screwdriver. Insert the RTR spring spacer into the control arm boss. To help, draw a line on the RTR spring spacer and control arm boss to maintain alignment, as well as a spot a 1/4 inch down from the upper edge of the boss. Using a center punch and hammer, dimple the control arm boss. Using a 1/8 drill bit, drill into the control arm boss and through the RTR spacer. Take one of the supplied roll pins and drive it through the control arm boss and into the RTR spacer using a drift punch and mallet. Ensure that the roll pin is flush with the outer edge of the control boss. Next, with some of the thread locker applied, install the socket head cap screw with a 5mm Allen wrench into the threaded RTR rear spacer hole. Your screw will slide into the OEM hole when installing the RTR rear spring spacer onto the control arm. Then, using the hole of the RTR rear spacer, align the pin on the bottom of the OEM spring insulator and install. Now remove the two 15mm bolts in the trailing arm mount and toss them out. On some models, there may be a cover that needs to be removed with a plastic rivet and 10mm bolt. Pull the trailing arm down and insert the supplied RTR spacers between the chassis and the arm mount. Insert by hand the supplied 18mm bolts. Once in place, they are torqued down to 129 pound-feet. Your vehicle may still have the factory alignment markings on the spring to ensure that you install the spring correctly. Push down on the control arm and reinstall the coil spring, making sure it sits correctly in both spring isolators. Slowly raise the control arm into the knuckle. If using a second jack, place on the trailing arm to assist. If need be, use a pry bar to help align the knuckle bolt hole and install one 15mm bolt finger tight. The knuckle will use the teardrop shaped nut. Lower the jack and place the shock into the control arm and back towards the upper mount. Install the lower shock 15mm bolt finger tight using the squared nut. Then install the two 18mm upper shock mount bolts. You will then torque the knuckle bolt, lower shock bolt, and both upper mount bolts to 81 pound-feet. Finally, reinstall the brake line clip with the curved fork end facing down. You may need to gently tap it in with the mallet. And now is as good a time as any to swap out the factory wheels for a set of Tech 6s, and you're good to go. Thank you so much for tuning in to today's episode. Hopefully you found it informative and useful in the installation of your product. And also know that if you head over to rtrvehicles.com, we have a full line of product for Mustang, Ranger, F-150, and Bronco. We also have a sweet line of merch. I swear this thing makes me look like 10 pounds lighter. I'm Jordan Wheeler with RTR Vehicles, and I'll catch you on the other side of fun.